And with that, we'll go ahead and move to some quick acknowledgements. I want to thank every partner and community group that worked with us to make this project happen, especially LULAC, HPCC, the Rotary Clubs of Chichino City and Galena Park, and the Citizen Climate Lobby. I also want to give special thanks to Working Partner, who worked very closely with us on the project itself and helped make stakeholder interviews happen, helped us make the survey as presentable and desirable and easy to fill out for as many community members as possible. All right, so just a quick overview of what's going on today. We're going to talk a good bit about CCS generally. We're going to talk about what happened on our report, what we found. We're going to talk about why do we care about CCS right this second. We're going to talk a good bit. We're going to have a quick panel question, Q&A and discussion shortly after. We're scheduled for an hour to an hour and a half. Probably split the difference, go for an hour and 15 minutes. We'll do our best to respect your time. So let's go back to the very beginning. Climate change is underway. We had a pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide of 350 part per million. Today, that is about 420. For us today, climate change represents the transfer of carbon from underground durable rocky layers to the atmosphere, made possible by the combustion of fossil fuels, right? Digging up coal, drilling for oil, methane to some degree, are all sources of carbon dioxide. There's also, carbon dioxide is also the byproduct of certain industrial processes, including the production of steel or cement. And just a side note, you can see a bit of a diurnal cycle there with the bloom of spring and the peeling back of greenery during the fall and winter. So we're sitting at about 420, but that oscillates depending on the time of year, and that is still trending upwards. So there are some consequences to adding all this energy and carbon to the atmosphere. Here in Houston, it's very explicit. Three major consequences include Winter Storm Uri, in which the entire state of Texas, or I should say a good chunk of it on the ERCOT grid, went out. And 200 people lost their lives from the ensuing chaos. Hurricane Harvey here in Houston and the Gulf Coast area dropped 52 inches of rain on us and depressed the crust of the earth below us. That's how much weight was put on us, on the planet by rainfall. Additionally, excess heat is becoming more common, heat waves. If you are in Texas and Houston right now, you know that very well. We are experiencing already something like 100+ degrees outside, and it's expected to get up to 110 in the next few days. So there are two tactics for addressing climate change. We can imagine our carbon budget for 1.5 Celsius, that's the goal we have set aside from the Paris Climate Accord, two tactics. If you can imagine that budget as a bucket and we are adding carbon or water to the bucket, you can stop adding water to the bucket or remove water from the bucket. We're mostly concerned with adding water to the bucket. How do we stop putting carbon in the atmosphere? How do we reduce the amount of carbon put in the atmosphere? Or what are the technologies that some are proposing to put less amount of carbon in the atmosphere? So you can kind of see that bucket analogy on the right. On the left, we have sources of carbon dioxide, generally in the state of Texas, industrial and transportation being the two largest. One caveat to this is that industrial has an outsized role to play in climate change mitigation, right? Transportation, that's the burning of gasoline and diesel, that comes from somewhere. Industrial facilities are, they come from industrial facilities, refineries, and for that reason, industrial sectors and refineries, petrochemicals have an outsized role to play in adaptation and mitigation. So there are two branches of carbon management. There's CCUS or CCU or CCS, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilization, or carbon capture and utilization and storage. They're basically interchangeable for our purposes here. And the basic idea is that carbon comes out of a smokestack. What if we added something to the smokestack so that less carbon comes out? Contrast that to carbon dioxide removal, where you completely draw carbon from the atmosphere out of the atmosphere and put it in a durable storage elsewhere. We will not be talking about CDR mostly whatsoever in this presentation. We are most concerned with carbon capture. There are prototypical carbon capture projects in Houston and the potential for more in the coming years. There is not a whole lot going on with carbon removal. So we do have a prototypical example of carbon capture in the Houston area right now. To the southwest of Houston, in Fort Bend County, we have the third largest coal-fired power plant in the country. It also is the site for one of the largest carbon capture prototypes in existence. It cost $1 billion, included a slush of cash from NRG, who owns the facility, JX Nippon Petroleum, a banking and petroleum firm, and a $200 million grant from the Department of Energy. Under the Clean Coal Plan, something of note is that this was 2015, 2016, when the project was announced and mostly permitted and underway, and is a enhanced oil recovery project, which I'll elaborate on a little bit more later. So there are some issues with Petronova. Petronova is pricey. $1 billion to reduce carbon emissions from a coal-fired power plant. That is a big, expensive pill to swallow. There's contention about how much renewable energy could you build out for $1 billion, you know? There's also the complexity of installing a totally new piece of tech and building out a new facility on top of an older facility, on top of an older industrial plant. That will always be very complicated and require a whole lot of engineering work. It's also energy intensive. WA Parish needed additional power generating units installed on the facility to make Petronova work. So several natural gas or methane power generating units were built on top of a coal-fired power plant to provide the energy for the facility. There's also contention over how efficient it was actually able to remove carbon. So proponents point out that it was able to remove 90% of the carbon generated from the gas component of the facility. But that's not the entire facility's carbon profile, which includes many coal-fired power plant units. Those did not have a huge portion of their carbon removed. For that reason, this plant is very much a net positive of carbon dioxide. And there's contention over if that is satisfactory to prove that this is a prototypical example of genuinely effective carbon removal, or I should say carbon capture. Additionally, this does nothing about coal ash, which is responsible for upwards of 300 deaths per year. It also, WA Parish is a serial offender. It goes out under stress, under not a whole lot of stress either. For example, the past few days when we had a conserve energy advisory from the state of Texas, that was because we lost certain power generating units, which did include in part WA Parish. Coal and gas often go MIA during the greatest demand for energy because of the stress from heat. And reactivating these are not cheap. Those shutdowns cost about $310 billion to get going. I'm thinking particularly of 3 impairments that occurred. Now, that was all kind of like side details. Why is it difficult to do carbon capture in the first place? It's complicated, but none of those are impossible to overcome. there is a bigger fundamental problem with Petronova. It is an enhanced oil recovery system. What happens to the carbon removed from an amine filter at the top of the smokestack is that the carbon is compressed and pumped by pipe 80 miles out west and used basically to frack and recover excess petroleum that is hard to recover. Very similar to other more conventional fracking systems. It is a way to recover even more fossil fuels and then sell that. And when this is your only way to make the facility financially viable, things can go haywire. If, for example, there's a big market disrupting event, like say a shutdown in which people are not in great demand of fossil fuel products, or if there is a global pandemic in which people are staying at home and not consuming gasoline or petroleum products generally, the facility is subject to the oil market and the cost of a barrel of oil. And when the cost of a barrel of oil dropped during the COVID-19 pandemic, this facility became even more of a financial burden than it was originally. And for that reason, in 2020, the whole entire Petronova project was shut down, put in reserve. Now, a small update is that in the past couple months, with the recovery of the price of a barrel of oil, Petronova is likely to be reactivated. It also probably helps that a whole lot of different laws and regulations have gone into effect to facilitate the expansion and financial vitality of carbon capture generally. So why are we talking about this now? Houston is ground zero for carbon capture technology development. We are the energy capital of the world. We have dozens of energy firms headquartered here. You can see a good number of them down there, all signed on to the creation of a carbon hub, which I will talk a little bit later on. And we have a panel question on that. But also because Houston is the center for the petrochemical industry and its infrastructure. There are pipelines, there are wells, there is the labor, there is the engineering capacity and the technical means or the technical skills concentrated in one place that can make carbon capture potentially extremely sort of like scalable and viable on a much larger scale than prototype. And note, so this top quote here, this piece of text is from a white paper from a proponent of the technology at the University of Houston. And they specifically mentioned the potential for enhanced oil recovery. The process which recovers fossil fuels or the more fossil fuel raw material made into fossil fuels that we can then use. So how much of this is a genuine climate solution and how much of this is the justifying the continued existence of industries and facilities which are probably past retirement age or have should be priorities for the transition to renewable energy, right? So we see here the pipeline infrastructure potential for carbon capture and storage. Part of why Houston is so desirable is the sheer volume of pipeline infrastructure. To save on cost, there is great emphasis on trying to recycle and reuse existing pipelines. You'll notice that there are branches and systems that all converge on West Texas and to a lesser degree on the Gulf Coast. Houston, Louisiana, Corpus Christi, and a little bit farther south. So they can move carbon from point sources and coal-fired power plants, gas power plants, various industrial facilities in the Midwest and the far north of the country, and store it in underwater and in surface wells across Texas and the Gulf Coast. Next, we have existing wells with the potential for EOR. You'll see again, there's sort of a pointing down, a chevron that points down towards Texas and Louisiana. Again, you can see a couple spots in the Midwest and the far north, but a whole lot of storage potential or recovery potential in West Texas, Oklahoma, and the Gulf states, particularly Louisiana and Texas. And there's also very serious concerns for the health of people and environmental justice. The Deep South, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, East Houston, and then in the smaller municipalities, these are EJ communities that have borne the brunt of the petrochemical industry previously. Have fence line communities been informed? Do they know what's going on? Do they understand carbon capture tech and what it means? And do they agree to take on those risks? I think one caveat here is that air toxic cancer risk, this is a proxy of environmental justice communities. So with the hyper concentration of resources in Houston, East Houston, Louisiana, and in parts of South Texas, there's the potential for the creation of something called a carbon hub. There are point sources, cement, electricity, right? Like W.A. Parish. There are petrochemical industries, like the oil and gas industry in east of Houston, in Louisiana. There is existing pipeline infrastructure, which could be compatible with newly built systems, or maybe recycled older systems. And there is an incredible scale of storage. I'll also add that there's a line off here about hydrogen use. We won't be touching on hydrogen here, but it is a part of the carbon capture landscape. Now, we talked a good bit about issues with Petronova attached to W.A. Parish coal plant. At every stage of carbon capture, there is trouble. There are potentials for things to go awry or complications. Not all of them are problems that cannot be overcome, but they do pose challenges and they do increase risk, both of catastrophic failure in the case of Sartarsha near Yazoo City, but also of less high-profile failure, right? If this is an attempt to mitigate climate change and it's not as effective as we thought, that is a sort of slow-moving catastrophe of its own. So first stage, removal. Does this technology actually remove carbon? There's some contention over that. Amine filters, there's all kinds of different ways to remove carbon. Petronova had its trouble with removing carbon dioxide from the entire facility. There's also permitting. Just because you have a filter on there or you have a carbon capture tech on there doesn't necessarily mean you're removing 90 or upwards % of the carbon emitted. You could very well be removing much less than that, even on a more narrow sort of project scope. And as we kind of enter or exit from sort of regulatory purgatory, what if the permits that they are expected do not require that they remove the great majority of carbon from a point source? We're starting to see a little bit of that already. Next is transportation. Every time you load and unload material from a vehicle or some sort of piece of transportation infrastructure, there's a risk of failure or catastrophic failure. Pipelines are high profile and intimidating and elicit frustration and reaction and condemnation pretty darn frequently. If y'all remember the struggles over Line 5 in Minnesota, that is a situation in which landowners and water activists put great effort in resisting new pipeline infrastructure. That's part of why old, or I should say recycled or reusing existing pipeline infrastructure is so desirable, right? It's pretty hard to resist the building of an existing pipeline, but you can't necessarily just reuse a pipeline, right? When those were built, they were meant and designed and built to move a certain type of material. That could be natural gas, that could be crude. CO2, H2, other carbon capture products have different properties and can cause corrosion or issues with pressure in the pipeline. These are things that can be overcome hypothetically, but this is still very new and we're still figuring out how to do it. And there's concern that maybe some pipeline infrastructure is not fit for reuse. So, for example, the Sartarsha CO2 pipeline explosion near Yazoo City, Alabama. Denbury Gulf Coast Pipeline, a company based out of Plano in Texas, was using this pipeline to move carbon dioxide to storage potential locations. The pipeline failed to contain it. The pipeline in this location detonated and resulted in hospitalizing something like 40 people, many of which do have chronic illness from this. Something like there's potential for catastrophic failure and damage to people and communities. There's also storage. Will it actually stay in the ground? When you put something down in the ground, you're trying to store it on a geological timescale. That is difficult to do, and that is a laudable goal, but it is a challenge. There's the potential for seismic activity, surface deformation, and if a well blows out, you could turn a carbon sink into a carbon source. For a tactic for carbon mitigation, that is its own sort of catastrophic failure. There's also concerns over mineral rights, land rights, who owns these wells, who has the right to put stuff in the wells, what kind of permit do you need? That is completely up in the air. The sort of regulatory environment is not quite ready for that. But we'll have someone who comes in a bit more about that later. And for these reasons, there's been great frustration and resistance to pipeline infrastructure. I mentioned Line 5 in Minnesota, but pipeline infrastructure across the Midwest is getting grief. Entire towns in Midwest states, including Iowa, have banned the use of eminent domain for pipeline infrastructure. And some municipalities have outright banned the building of this infrastructure in their limits. Now, it's probably up in the air whether anyone would have built a carbon capture or a CO2 pipeline under the French Quarter. But nonetheless, this does indicate sort of the momentum built against CO2 and new pipeline infrastructure. Now, we've been talking about prototypical examples and sort of a nascent form of technology. But recent legislation has turbocharged its potential development. There was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. The former set aside billions. Right here, we have about $16–17 billion put aside for carbon capture and transportation and sequestration. So that could mean inserting, that can mean the construction or rehabilitation of new pipeline infrastructure. That can mean subsidizing new carbon capture projects, similar to Petronova. And then the expansion of the 45Q tax credit. 45Q, in essence, gives you a credit on your taxes if you sequester X amount of carbon. It previously was a number that industry said was too low to make it an industry or a lucrative proposition. It has recently been expanded and made higher in an attempt to make storage of carbon a potentially lucrative industry. But the big thing here is that it's taking an incredible amount of subsidy from the state and from the federal government to make this jumpstart. And there's always questions about how much should we subsidize industry and private projects, and how much of this is righteous in the form of like carrots over sticks, getting encouraging sequestration. It's just a thought. So let's go ahead and move on to the report. So for the past year, Air Alliance Houston has been working on gauging the knowledge communities have about carbon capture in the Houston area, with a premium on fence line and on fence line communities. The two big hotspots that we investigated are Fort Bend, the site for Petronova, and East Houston and the East Houston area. So thinking of also like Galena Park, Jacinto City, and more. Up to this point, carbon capture and carbon management generally has been the business of industrial groups, universities, governments, and other agencies. But communities that are near where these projects are going to be sited are not necessarily involved in the conversation. At Air Alliance, we want to assimilate perspectives that that communities have and make those a part of our advocacy, and to arm people with the ability to self-advocate. We also wanted to put forth other climate change mitigation strategies. Is CCS the only tool in the toolbox for a climate action plan that firms and the government have? All right. So we had two components to this project. One was surveys administered at community meetings with a short CCS 101 beforehand, and tabling at community events. We also held a series of stakeholder interviews with government electeds, business leaders and business representatives, environmental justice leaders, and environmental activists. So one quick bit about the surveys is that because, as we suspected, people were generally unfamiliar with this technology, this topic, carbon management, carbon capture, being a part of carbon management, we need to provide the basics of this technology. And that introduces we are educating people about this topic. and then surveying their first impressions, essentially. That introduces potential for complications to the survey, to the project, and we fully acknowledge that. And we planned around it with keeping impartiality in mind. Another component to this was a qualitative assessment. What we wanted to do was collect testimonies. We wanted to collect perspectives. We wanted to collect first impressions. And we did that with the interviews, the stakeholder interviews, with open-ended questions for our surveys. And we considered hosting even focus groups. So there are a couple of takeaways. One, people are concerned about climate change. As we mentioned at the very beginning of this, people fully understand that climate change is underway and that there are consequences to it. Seen here, you can see overwhelming understanding that climate change is underway and a connection between climate and extreme weather. We also found deep dissatisfaction with action on climate change up to this point. Skepticism and disillusionment is a theme that you'll see throughout the survey so far. We also found a broad lack of familiarity with carbon tech and carbon capture. Very few people are familiar with the tech going into the CCUS 101, and very few people felt confident in their knowledge of the technology after. The respondents on the left are answers pulled from a survey given after the CCUS 101, and respondent Z, I think, sums up a whole lot of what we encountered. I'm not familiar enough to say. This is consistent with what the Clean Air Task Force found in their own survey. Only 12% said or self-reported familiar or aware of carbon tech or carbon capture among Houstonians. There was also deep skepticism of industrial spokespeople and representatives and government. Many people, or I should say, we also tied this to industrial development, and many respondents do not trust industry to keep their word. This is mostly in line with what we've observed in permit hearings, in our CAMP program, our community air monitoring program. People are looking for people or for spokespeople, for advocates who they can put stock in what they say. I'll add as well, a bit of a side note, we made great effort to include not just carbon and climate in this discussion. We asked a question to the effect of, what is your greatest concern right now, regardless of topic? And things like community violence and things like that came up pretty often. There's a caveat to that. This was in fall and winter and summer of last year during an election year. There's also a deep lack of trust in industry and in government and in regulators. We found that a lot of fence line communities have generally a lot of trust in experts, in scientists, in environmental groups and advocates, but a lot more skepticism and distrust of government and media and industry. You see here this chart, right? This box right here. This is actually from the Clean Air Task Force again, and we found that our results were broadly in line with what their survey from a year or so ago. So we have some recommendations going forward. One, we need a community education program on carbon capture, and we need it now. There's a whole lot of money going into carbon capture, and it's going to start being delivered, dispersed, and it's going to start resulting in development in the next couple of years. Community generally needs more information to be able to confidently self-advocate. There needs to be a holistic and aggressive, aggressivism is quite the word, to carry out community education. We also realize that there's going to be a whole lot of this development in the coming years. We need communities to be engaged with in good faith. We need environmental justice considered. And we need developers, entrepreneurs, we need venture capital, we need government and universities to come in and discuss this in good faith and communicate the benefits and the risks. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move us along to our panel discussion. So first, some quick introductions. We have Virginia Palacios, Executive Director of Commission Shift, a statewide nonpartisan nonprofit focused on accountability at the Railroad Commission of Texas, State Oil and Gas Oversight Agency. Virginia was recently selected for the White House Task Force on Carbon Dioxide Capture, Utilization, and Sequestration. Commission Shift has organized individuals and organizations across the state to provide feedback to the EPA and the White House on the Railroad Commission's poor track record of overseeing pipelines and injection wells in Texas, arguing that the Railroad Commission should not be in charge of overseeing carbon dioxide injections wells in the state of Texas. Palacios holds a Master's of Environmental Management degree from Duke and has worked on environmental issues related to oil and gas development since 2011. We have Luke Metzger, Executive Director of Environment Texas, a nonprofit advocate for clean air, clean water, parks and wildlife, and a livable climate. Over the last 25 years, he has successfully sued some of the state's biggest air polluters, helped with approval of climate action plans in Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and Austin, and convinced the Texas legislature to invest $1 billion to create new state parks. He is co-author of the recent report, Climate Change in Texas, Impacts, Sources of Pollution, and the Path Towards Keeping Our Climate Livable. Give me a sec. Sorry, Lilia. I'll slow down just a little bit more. We also have Courtney Holness, Senior Policy Advisor at Carbon 180, a new breed of climate NGO on a mission to reverse 2 centuries of carbon emissions. Working closely with U.S. policymakers, entrepreneurs, and peer organizations, Carbon 180 designs policies that will bring necessary carbon removal solutions to gigaton scale. Courtney supports the tech policy team at Carbon 180, where she identifies and pursues opportunities to bolster their advocacy on direct air capture and shape federal policies that enable just, equitable, safe, and high accountability implementation of carbon removal technologies. We have Carmen Caveza, who leads the Climate Justice Campaign, working closely with residents at the front line of the climate crisis for SEER. SEER is a coalition that works to raise awareness of the connections between pollution, place, and the public's health. Carmen works on the intersection of climate change and its impacts on health. The campaign focuses on climate-proofing communities' homes to help residents become more resilient and achieve better health outcomes. So I have set aside, or I should say, I prepared 7 questions, the 7 things that we need to know about carbon capture in Houston. These are questions that have come from community meetings and from stakeholder interviews, big themes, right? And I've go ahead and I'm going to ask our panel to jump in on these. So first question I have is, who regulates carbon management in Texas, including CCS and CDR? Can you go ahead and come in on this, maybe Virginia?
Sure, thanks, Alex. So there are different parts of the CCS supply chain, right? You have the carbon capture, whether that's at a power plant or one of these new direct air capture facilities that are basically not in existence yet. And then, so there's the capture portion, and then there's the transportation portion, which, you know, most likely is going to be pipelines. And then there's storage or injection. And so storage can be either storage in a class 6 permanent carbon dioxide storage well, or a class 2 well that's used for enhanced oil recovery, which is one of the comments that I made in the chat. And so right now, the Railroad Commission of Texas, our state's oil and gas regulator, has jurisdiction over pipeline safety in Texas. And they are applying for what's called primacy from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so that the Railroad Commission can be the sole permitting and regulatory authority for Class 6 carbon dioxide storage wells in Texas. And so right now, the Railroad Commission is going through a rulemaking so that they can match their state rules for carbon dioxide storage with the federal rules. And there's actually an open public comment period on that rulemaking, and the deadline is July 31st. So if you have concerns about how this might take place or what might happen with these types of injection wells, you can make a public comment to the Railroad Commission from now until July 31st to impact those rules. And so when it comes to the capture side, typically the TCEQ would have jurisdiction over any air emissions that come from these facilities. However, it's important for everybody to know that carbon dioxide is not regulated as a pollutant at the federal level or the state level. And so if you have leaks of carbon dioxide from any of these facilities, there are no rules that would make that a violation. Companies would not be penalized unless maybe somebody was hurt. And so, we could have as many, these facilities could have as many leaks as they want, and there's no rules preventing that.
Awesome. Thank you, Virginia. We can go ahead and move on if no one else has any additions to that contribution. How about what kinds of carbon technology projects are already in existence, in planning, or on the horizon? And how does CCS affect air quality? Do you think you can come in on this, Virginia?
Yeah, I'll get that one too. And so, as I mentioned, there's these two types of ways to store carbon dioxide: in a class 2 well where you get more oil out of the ground, or a class 6 well where it's supposed to be permanent. And so I say supposed to be because the rules actually allow for a company to go back in later and extract that CO2 and possibly use it for more enhanced oil recovery. So this kind of paradigm that people say we're creating right now might not actually be a new energy future. It might just continue to be the same fossil fuel paradigm that we've been on, where we're just injecting carbon dioxide so we can get more oil out of the ground and the cycle continues. And so that's really important to be aware of. And so right now, there are only 2 companies that are applying for class 6, like carbon dioxide storage, permanent storage wells from the EPA. And because the Railroad Commission doesn't have primacy yet, this is all under the EPA right now. And so there's 2 companies, and they have proposals in Ector and Gaines counties. Those are counties out in West Texas and the Permian Basin, where you have a lot of like small power plants, but I think they're not really going to be capturing carbon from those power plants. Those are primarily going to be what's called direct air capture facilities. And so folks who are in support of these technologies say that direct air capture facilities are important. If you think about the energy transition and us eventually transitioning off of maybe using natural gas or coal for power plants, then these direct air capture facilities would be important for capturing legacy emissions or other emissions from other sources where it's hard to capture carbon dioxide, like from the cement or the steel industries. But again, like these are going to be facilities capturing and storing carbon in West Texas, where there's a lot of oil and gas development. Even though these will be class 6 wells, we have no guarantees that that CO2 will not eventually be used for enhanced oil recovery.
Gotcha. Thank you, Virginia. And I want to add one quick component to this. We got a lot of questions about, okay, well, you're putting this on top of an existing petrochemical site. I assume that it is also a source of air pollution.
Well, there's a couple of different things to be aware of there. Okay, let me first start with the carbon capture phase when we talk about air quality. And so when you add a carbon capture facility to a power plant, that carbon capture facility also needs its own power plant. And so the irony is that you could get more kind of air pollutants from that power plant, like nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides or other things that cause smog, right? And result in air pollution that can affect respiratory conditions. So that's one way that air quality can be affected. Another way that the environment can be affected, not just air quality, is from these existing oil fields, right? And so what we're finding at Commission Shift is that there are a lot of unplugged wells all across the state. And so some of these wells are orphaned, they have no owners, and it's the state's responsibility to plug these wells. But other wells have active operators that simply are not plugging their wells. And that creates an opportunity for these injection wells to potentially cause groundwater contamination if they end up connecting with these unplugged wells. One way that groundwater can be contaminated is because carbon dioxide, when it mixes with water, creates a strong acid called carbonic acid. And we heard a testimony from an oil and gas operator during the legislative session who said that he drilled through a CO2 acid gas plume that was caused by a class 2 injection well, and it completely ate away his 5-inch heavy duty drill bit. And so the potential for carbonic acid and water contamination is not something to be taken lightly with either class 2 or class 6 carbon dioxide injection.
I think what we try to emphasize as well is broadening out, kind of like talking about environmental justice and all of this. We'll be talking a bit more about EJ later. Is that there's sometimes too narrow focus on carbon, right? Climate change is urgent and we need to address it ASAP. But a clean coal plant is oxymoronic. And as mentioned with WA Parish, people get hurt from coal ash and the consequences of fossil fuel industry for air quality. And if you install $1 billion worth of tech on something, you're not going to close it down. WA Parish is a burden on NRG, even though they'll acknowledge that financial burden, I should say. So there's sort of a dragging out of existing fossil fuel infrastructure in this desperate attempt to try and keep it going a little longer, and that's dangerous and has consequences.
Yeah, if I could add to that, this is Luke. We know that air pollution in Texas causes thousands of premature deaths every year, and according to studies from Harvard, MIT, and others. And so if we're only capturing carbon from these facilities, or even if we're installing other kind of pollution controls, there's still going to be really deadly pollution coming from these facilities potentially for decades to come, as you said, because they're making such a huge investment in it. And so it's definitely not a panacea. If it works, you're dealing with one problem, but you're then potentially perpetuating a whole set of other problems.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and move us along to number 3. What kind of conditions are there for federal funding of carbon tech, including CCS? What expectations are attached to federal dollars earmarked for carbon tech? And what about community benefit agreements? Courtney, do you feel good about answering that?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And thank you to everybody joining the webinar today. And I'm really happy to be sitting alongside all of these fabulous panelists. I wanted to sort of start by saying that at Carbon 180, we focus on carbon dioxide removal, which is a term that we use to encompass a wide array of approaches that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere directly and store that to create negative emissions. However, we do believe that reducing emissions is important, obviously. So alongside aggressive emissions reductions, we believe that we need to be doing carbon dioxide removal because there really is no silver bullet against climate change. This is a complex problem, and there are trade-offs and shortcomings for all of these solutions that we're talking about today. So our strongest option is a wide and balanced portfolio of solutions. And so with that, talking about the federal conditions for carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal, we've seen that Congress and the administration have recognized the role of these tools and the role that they will play in helping the US meet our climate goals. So I'll start by talking about the carbon negative shot, which in 2021, the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management announced the Carbon Negative Shot initiative to advance the development and commercialization of and reduce the cost of carbon removal, sequestration, and other relevant technologies on a significant scale, prioritizing life cycle accounting, equity and justice, and durable storage. So by 2050, we need to be removing gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and our oceans to meet these climate goals. To put that into perspective, 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide is equivalent to approximately 1/5 of the United States annual carbon emissions in 2022. So it's a big task at hand. And this goal is going to require an investment of funding and resources to enable the scale up of technologies in support of these climate goals. So the carbon negative shot is meant to help spur innovation and position the US enterprises as leaders in research, manufacturing, and deployment in carbon dioxide removal, which must have a global sort of ramp up by mid-century. So with that goal in mind, funding for carbon removal was virtually non-existent until the year of 2018. And that's changed dramatically over the past few years. In 2022, we saw $1 billion in annual appropriations for carbon removal. And this funding spanned across research, development, and demonstrations, as well as a pilot purchasing program for carbon removal services and products, which we call procurement. We also saw funding for forest preservation, land conservation, and continued development and improvement of tools and frameworks that accurately can measure, report, verify, and account for carbon removal and sequestration. This year, Congress actually appropriated $154 million to continue support for these critical priorities that I just went over to advance carbon removal. And it also includes things like agricultural research, tree nurseries, geologic carbon storage permitting, and more. I would also add that in the Inflation Reduction Act, it rehauled the 45Q tax credit for carbon sequestration, making it more accessible to developers. So that included an increased credit value of $180 per ton for direct air capture that is paired with geologic storage. It also provides renewable energy generation and investment tax credits that are relevant to the sector. And I would also add that in 2021, Congress made a down payment on early direct air capture projects with the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which provided $3.5 billion in funding over 5 years for several direct air capture facilities through the program. And so this program is currently underway. The Department of Energy is currently reviewing applications for the first funding opportunity under this program, with more than $1.2 billion of that total funding currently up for grabs. We will be expecting award announcements later this summer, and a second funding opportunity for this program next year or possibly later. And the Regional Direct Air Capture Hubs program closely follows the launch of the Carbon Negative Shot, which is aiming to advance carbon removal across land-based and technological pathways to get them under $100 per ton of CO2 while ensuring durable storage, robust life cycle accounting, and the potential for gigaton scale deployment by 2030. So this program is really going to start setting the foundation for the carbon removal sector. And these projects are going to play a really big role in how the future looks for this sector. If I could just add a couple more sentences on the latter two questions here. The Department of Energy is currently requiring community benefits plans for all of the bipartisan infrastructure law and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding opportunities. So these are now required as part of any of those programs under those legislation. And these benefits plans are based on a set of 4 core policy priorities, which include investing in America's workforce, engaging communities and labor, advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and implementing the Justice 40 program. As a part of a community benefits plan, can be included a community benefits agreement. So it's one potential outcome as a community benefits plan, but essentially a community benefits agreement is an agreement that is signed by community groups or coalitions and a project developer, which identifies community or labor benefits that a developer would agree to deliver in return for community support or workforce availability for a project. So these agreements can help ensure that there are measurable local benefits in a community. And it should be expected that these agreements include information about project deliverables, reporting requirements, and also, making sure that they're publicly available documents and that they are accessible. So they're kind of mutually reinforcing between state government officials and also developers and the community interests. But I'll take a pause and see if any of my panelists want to add anything to this question.
I would like to add something. I think there has been some concern with the federal tax credits because in past years when these federal tax credits were made available, there was about $900,000 in documented fraud from the companies that claimed the tax credits. And so I think what advocates are calling for right now is a closer look from the IRS at how program applicants are actually documenting their achievements with these projects and ensuring that carbon is going where it's supposed to go. And they're not just sort of like checking the box and filling out forms and collecting almost $1 billion in tax credits, right? And so I just wanted to flag that because I think it's something really important for us to all be aware of, is that we shouldn't be giving away public dollars and not receiving a public benefit.
Great. And with the interest of time, I think I'm going to move us along onto number 4. I'm also going to put out just a reminder. We have an interpretation that so we're asking people to speak just a little slower or in bursts. Yeah. Move us on to number 4 here. Who's funding carbon tech at the federal level, and who are the leading proponents or firms? What do you think, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, as we've discussed, there's a ton of federal money coming from the Department of Energy, resulting from the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So, some $12 billion from the infrastructure law that's going for carbon capture and removal equipment, for carbon transport, and for carbon storage. And then in addition to that, there's as we've talked about, the 45Q tax credit, which the $85 per ton now is roughly what it costs, to apply carbon capture to hydrogen production, and close, to the cost for other applications. And then in addition to that, there's the Energy Department has about $250 billion in loan guarantees available for carbon capture projects. And all this federal money then is spurring a big increase in investment from venture capitalists and others. So in 2019, venture capitalists put in about $3.2 billion into carbon capture technologies. In just the first 3 quarters of last year, they invested $10.7 billion. So a huge surge in private capital following and chasing that federal money. And then the leading proponents, here in Houston, there's a whole coalition, the CCS Alliance, that's working to develop a carbon hub in Houston, and that includes, who's who of big polluters in America. So Exxon, Shell, Chevron, Dow, Phillips 66, BASF, on and on. And then we talked a little bit about direct air capture, but in Texas, Occidental Petroleum is the big player on that. They've got 2 different projects they're working on. One out in Ector County in the Permian Basin, that they'll use some of that captured carbon for the enhanced oil recovery. And then another project on the historic King Ranch in South Texas, but they'll be using that. They'll sell credits to other companies that are looking to reach their net zero emissions goals.
Great, thank you, Luke. I'll have one more for you, actually. Can you talk a bit more about the Exxon Carbon Hub? You mentioned it a little bit there.
Yeah, so Exxon is planning a big carbon project at their Baytown refinery and chemical complex, which is the largest manufacturing facility in America and one of the biggest polluters in America. My organization, Environment Texas, and the Sierra Club have been engaged in a 14-year-long legal battle over Exxon Baytown for millions of pounds of illegal air pollution. And now what they're proposing is to build a hydrogen plant that would produce what's called blue hydrogen. Convert using natural gas to produce hydrogen, and then the carbon dioxide that's generated from the production would be captured on site and transported to the Gulf of Mexico and stored under the ocean floor. And they then have said that they would provide surplus hydrogen that they produce that they don't need. The hydrogen would be used to help power their olefins plant in the Baytown complex, thereby lowering, they estimate, emissions by 30%. Any extra hydrogen they have or any extra CO2 storage capacity they have, they would make available to other local industry. And so together, as part of this industry-wide coalition in Houston, they've set out a goal of capturing 50 million tons of CO2 per year by 2030, which, if they're successful, that means thanks to those 45Q tax credits, the industry players would earn more than $4 billion every year from taxpayers for 12 years, so $48 billion. So a lot of money available for these companies.
Yeah. Thank you, Luke. Is there anyone else who come in a little bit about this before we move on? Cool. If not, I'm going to move us on to number 6. What is environmental justice, and what environmental justice implications are there for carbon management or carbon capture in particular? And what environmental implications are there for its expansion? Can I ask you to come in on this, Courtney? You talked a bit about this earlier as well.
Yeah, I would love to. The environmental justice movement is a result of the long-standing work of grassroots movements and Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color who have called for change and justice. Environmental justice was intentionally named and adapted from the term environmental racism because of the systemic racism in city planning, leaving Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color and low-income communities disproportionately exposed to toxic chemicals, hazardous waste facilities, and poorer air and water quality. In 1987, a report was published called Toxic Waste and Race in the US. And that report confirmed that race was the most potent factor or predictor for where hazardous waste facilities are located in the US. A few years later, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was hosted. And that is where the 17 principles of environmental justice were created. And these principles continue to guide the movement today. More formally, the definition of environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with the respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. I think it's important to note here that environmental justice communities are not monolithic groups. The values and definitions behind environmental justice will vary by community, each having distinct values and priorities. But at a high level, this definition is sort of what we aspire towards. As a tool for both movements, both the environmental justice and climate justice movement, which connects climate change to ongoing international human rights and racial justice issues. Both of these movements, carbon removal can contribute to healthy living environments, community self-determination, and equal protections for all. And this can look a few different ways. When we think about environmental justice, we can consider, what does land access and land ownership look like? What are community-driven benefits from these projects? How can we minimize additional harm? How can we redress past harms? And how can we ensure community decision-making power and self-determination? I think in the lens of climate justice, we can consider ideas about transferring investments for carbon removal technologies, transferring the financing and the technologies, and really just thinking about international collaboration on carbon removal research and development and demonstrations. There are some relevant justice types when thinking about carbon removal, from the project developer mindset or even from a policymaker mindset. So I would just leave the fact that we should be thinking about procedural justice, which is fairness in the decision-making process, making sure that we have strong community outreach at project inception and ensuring that continues throughout the project's lifetime. There's distributive justice, which looks at the equitable allocation of resources, like the risks, the impacts, and the benefits as they are distributed across society. So we could think about this in, the sense of developers co-creating community benefits agreements with communities to codify things like wealth creation or improved air and water quality. There's reparative justice, which looks at repairing previous harms committed through violations and crimes, like we've been talking about here today. So we can consider the global north leveraging their extensive network and resources to deploy carbon removal for the purpose of removing legacy emissions alongside those aggressive emissions reductions. And then finally, transformative justice, which is spurring change in the current systems and structures of our societies. And so I like to think about renewable energy deployment in this sense, and the shift that we can have in energy generation through looking at a carbon removing economy. So how does this tie into carbon removal? It truly offers a way to support communities who have suffered from climate injustice by directly removing planet warming emissions from the atmosphere. But at scale, deploying carbon removal at scale we need for climate goals will require substantial physical and human infrastructure. And solutions can really only provide regionally appropriate co-benefits if communities have that agency to control and co-design the development of projects in their communities. So without prioritizing environmental justice, there's a real risk that carbon removal solutions, which we see as a necessary tool to meet our climate goals, they can follow a similar path of sustaining extractive relationships with disadvantaged communities. And it's going to be incredibly important in the coming years to identify how to scale up carbon removal in a way that aligns with environmental justice priorities. But fortunately for the field, it's still early. We're still talking about these projects that haven't necessarily been deployed yet. And so we still have an opportunity to integrate equity and justice into every step of the evolution of these technologies, from research to the development and the deployment. And I think the last thing I will say is that, how we develop these technologies really matters. It matters where they're placed and where they're sited. It matters whether communities are offered benefits or not. It matters if these technologies are designed in ways that offer communities good employment and local revenues. And these are all choices that we have to make. And so empirical science is something that can help us articulate these choices. And so between that, I will leave some space for my other panelists to come in on this question.
Thanks, Courtney. I really want to add to that. And I think you outlined a lot of ways for ensuring justice. And just to put it simply, it's like we can't have environmental justice without a functioning justice system. And to add some real world context to that, what we are seeing in West Texas and what we saw from the Denbury Gulf Coast pipeline explosion in Satartia, Mississippi, there are all these examples of injustice after an accident happens, right? And so, we, not just in West Texas, but throughout the state, a commission shift, we've been talking to a lot of people in communities who have been fighting permit applications for waste disposal facilities. And they are having to spend six figures, hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight these permit applications over years and years. And that is just not something that poor communities can do. It's impossible to participate in a justice system if it is too expensive to participate in. And if the regulatory system allows companies to keep coming back over and over and over again until the communities are completely worn out and have no money and no energy left to fight. And so, you know, we can't ensure that there will be justice with these facilities until we fix that regulatory structure. And so that's what we're doing at Commission Shift, at least on the Railroad Commission side. And I know a lot of the other organizations that are here focused on other agencies like the TCEQ and other aspects, and maybe the DOE, right? But I think, you know, also when it comes to the Denbury Gulf Coast pipeline explosion in Mississippi, you know, that is a Texas-based operator, but just because they're a Texas-based operator doesn't mean they aren't operating in other states. And what we saw in Satartia was that this was a predominantly Black community that was affected by that explosion. To add to what Alex was saying earlier, when CO2 escapes, it sinks. And so in that particular explosion, there was this CO2 plume over the roadway, and people who drove through the plume experienced hypoxia. So they almost suffocated and they lost oxygen. And so there's a recording of the 911 call where a young woman who had asthma is just gasping for breath. And that is unfortunately all too common of a condition in communities of color. Black communities have much higher rates of asthma than other demographic groups. Hispanic communities have higher rates as well, but it's the worst in Black communities. And so especially when we think about the Gulf Coast and some of these hubs being planned for places like Houston that are already in ozone non-attainment, adding these other facilities that not only could result in carbon dioxide leaks that could affect public health, but also are using different chemical compounds as solvents, and those chemical compounds come with other health impacts. You know, it's just this like piled up burden, and we need serious reform at our state agencies in Texas and in other states that are going to be seeing this technology, because we are already dealing with too high of environmental burdens. And so to add one more technology on top of this that could cause additional justice impacts is too much. And so, so there's a real need to focus on restructuring these agencies and ensuring that justice can be served.
Awesome. Thank you, Virginia. For the sake of time, I am going to move us along to question 7. In this one, I did want to set aside for you, Carmen. What do Houston area community members think about all of this, right? In your experience, are people talking about this at all? What do people know? It kind of overlaps a little bit with the report. I think you have an important perspective to add.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for having me. And basically, the answer is no. I've been kind of just testing community knowledge about this since you invited me to this webinar, and they have no idea. Our communities are so busy, and they have experienced so many issues currently with this heat that this is another issue that is they're completely disconnect, right? So when we think about this type of all solutions, we have to also communicate that with the community, right? And they have the right to know how it's going to be affecting their health. One of the things that it made me think regarding carbon capture is liability, long-term liability. When I've been doing some research, it's just the long-term liability is not clear. Is they passing that to the states, or who are going to be responsible if something happened, let's say 50 years down the road? There's an issue in the Northeast community with creosote that is causing cancer, right? And the main problem why community haven't really get resolution is because there's the difficulty tying the type of cancer within a specific contaminant of the ground. So if we talk about 50 years from now, something happens, some pipe leaks, how are they going to be connecting the disease of that person to an exposure, or how they going to be making the case that they get sick because something like this happened? So this is an issue that the community haven't even had, at least in the communities that I work. And I want to make that clear. I work in the Northeast. I just kind of tested the knowledge of the residents that I work with. They have no idea what carbon capture is. They have no idea that this big facility or this plan to build this hub is coming to Houston. and they have no idea how they're going to be affected. So that's the reality.
Awesome. Thank you, Carmen. I'm going to keep moving us along because I know we're probably going to go over just probably a couple minutes. So if you need to drop out, I totally understand. I do want to give a give an opportunity to Virginia to shout out an opportunity to get involved. Someone asked a question in the chat to that effect. You know, what can I do? What opportunities are there?
Right. And so I mentioned earlier that the Railroad Commission is applying for primacy from the EPA to be the sole permitting and regulatory authority in the US, or sorry, in Texas for carbon dioxide injection wells, class 6 carbon dioxide injection wells specifically. And so that comment period is open through July 31st. There will be a couple of other opportunities coming up in the near future, but we don't have deadlines around those yet. And so we're expecting that by the end of this year or next year, the EPA will open a formal public comment period on the primacy application, and folks will be able to comment on that. And then we also have heard from the U.S. Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration that they're considering a carbon dioxide pipeline rulemaking. And so right now, carbon dioxide pipelines have no special federal regulations. And this is important because when carbon dioxide combines with water, you get that carbonic acid. And so you can have different types of corrosion occurring on pipelines that don't normally occur with other materials. So it's important to have special regulations for CO2 pipelines. And so when that rulemaking gets underway with the Federal Pipeline Administration, then folks will be able to comment on that. And I'll go ahead and drop some links in the chat so you all can stay up to date on those opportunities. Thanks, Spike.
We can also send it out as a follow-up email, give an opportunity. We're going to be sending out an email with just with the link to the report, the link to the recording, and we can also tag in the opportunity or the comment guide or something similar. With that, I'm going to, I want to close out and say, thank you everyone for who was able to make it and come. The report is now, as of like right this second, up on the site. So if you can take a look at it right now, download it, and learn all there is. And we have it in both English and Spanish. We also put out a newsletter. I encourage everyone to give that a look over. And we have our social media available. Encourage everyone to give those a look. Thank you to all of our panelists who were able to come and come in on these very difficult topics, ranging from everything from environmental justice to community knowledge. And thank you to everyone who was able to take time out of their day to attend the webinar and listen in. And with that, have a good rest of your day.